Good afternoon. My name is Shannon Hallback, and this is my presentation on my research paper. The name of my paper is How Stereotypes Are Broadcasted Within the Media. So, for a little bit of background on the paper, I wrote it at UCF in my ENC 1102 class, and it is supposed to be about something in our life and society that we have noticed and that we have perceived. I chose this topic because there is a lot of prejudice in America, and a lot of it is focused on the African American community. As a member of this community myself, I did feel like this topic could impact me, and it was my job to educate the public on something that we may not have been paying attention to. Even though in my newer generation, we do not watch the news as often as our parents, there is still stereotypes that are taking place. And that can shift our own perception of people and the community that they belong to. When it comes to the news, African Americans are portrayed in a very negative light compared to white people who are being broadcasted for the same crime. The lack of equal representation in the news is what causes the viewers to see Black people in a negative way. And it is strongly different from the way that I view white people. This topic is solely focused on criminals within the news and their news stories. Though all criminals should be sentenced correctly for committing illegal acts that they have engaged in, they still belong to a race group in America. The way that they are portrayed will reflect badly on the hardworking citizens who identify with that race. That leads me to my thesis paper. My thesis statement for the paper, which is African Americans are negatively portrayed in the news and broadcasting media. The news should not misrepresent African American community because it is causing viewers to have an inaccurate perception of this group in America. When pictures and words are chosen in the news, they are chosen strategically to negatively represent Black people. This type of habit can cause racial profiling and attacks on the Black community. African Americans being ridiculed is nothing uncommon in America. African Americans are shown in the news with mugshots when they are reported for a crime. When white people commit a crime, they tend to show professional images and even family photos, and that makes them look less threatening, regardless of what crime they commit. The words that are being used in the news is also a very big issue. African Americans are shown and also referred to as thugs, which tends to be the only race group who tends to get these kind of words, and that can cause a bad disparity. Which leads to the significance of the paper. This topic is extremely important and significant because of how many people it is affecting in their everyday lives. On the news, the choices of images that are shown of the criminals and the crimes are completely appalling. As a society, we need to take a step back, view this issue as something more than just a race issue. If the same crime is committed, the choice of language or images should be the same as well. This gives a sense of unity so that we may not have a negative perception of just one race group. In the images below is an observation and analysis of one of the sources of my paper. As you can see, the two images are of different cases that have been taking place, and it's the same broadcasted news outlet that have posted them. On the left is of 3 Caucasian men who have committed the crime of burglary. They have images of a suit and tie as their images of the case. On the right is of African Americans who have committed the same crime of burglary. The images shown of these men are completely different from the left side. They are mugshots which do not depict African American men as upstanding citizens. The men to the left have legitimate mugshots from their shooting of the mugshots, but the news chose the professional pictures instead. Even if the African American men did not have a professional image that could have been used, the news has still wanted to make the white men appear as less threatening. This is a prime example of how the perception of people can be very significant. The many studies that have researched and conducted, which will be discussed later, has shown that the appearance of danger and threat through the news can create a bias towards a race group. This affects not only the suspects when it comes to sentencing and trial, it can also negatively impact those who are of the same race group that are living in America. The negative perception of them can cause racial profiling as well as being perceived as dangerous when that can be completely false. This is why it's crucial that there's more awareness of this issue and we can implement real change in our communities. Research. When it came to research, the first research was from researcher E.B. Gunwald on meaning making. She created the article of Capturing Meaning Making in Journalism. Meaning making is a central feature of journalism practice. The minimal success of the journalism fundamentally depends on the production of the media text units, printed articles, broadcast programs, which are supposed to be meaningful to readers, listeners, and viewers. Rhetoric is the art of effective or persuasive speaking or writing. And according to Making Sense of Human Interactions and Meaning Making, it is explained that it's essential to explain rhetoric because it has many meanings. And I said that rhetoric offers principles of human interaction. It is also emphasized thoroughly how some news stories implicitly link Black people to dire circumstances within the community, such as poverty, violence, crime, drugs, and even prisons. According to the Florida statutes of 812.13, robbery means the taking of money and other property, which can be subject to larceny from the person in custody of another. Basically, when talking about meaning making and rhetoric, that shows that news outlets have the capability of portraying and creating a sense of meaning to the images and words that they use. That can be very harmful if they choose the wrong images and words because they can link dangerous materials and dangerous subjects towards a race group. Moving on to my first research or second research source, which was documented, was from Abraham Linus and Apia Osai, and that was Framing News Stories, the Role of Visual Imagery in Priming Racial Stereotypes. The research I learned was from Howard Journal of Communications, and they created an experiment by testing how African Americans with a negative news story can possibly affect the perception of African Americans to the viewers. Their research consisted of evaluating the images of online news stories. Some of the images included white people, others were of African Americans. The researchers conducted this story and study using 177 white undergraduate students in Midwestern University around the age of 20 years old. The stimuli were of different news stories, and the topic was about a 3-strike rule for crime laws and school vouchers. The only differences of the versions of the story were the images that went with them. Some of the versions were randomly selected, and that was of no image, black people, white people, or black person and white person. After each story, the participants were asked to explain their perception and how each population or area will be affected by the specific public policy, from a scale of not at all to extremely affected. The results concluded that blacks were perceived to be affected more. The study demonstrates that implicit visual imagery of a black person alongside stories that are seemingly race neutral can influence the way that white participants perceive how certain populations are affected by specific issues. Moving on to the next research that I have conducted was from researcher Franklin D. Gilliam, and that was from proximity and local television news on attitudes about race and crime. For this experiment, white neighbors of various neighborhoods were analyzed to view the racial context of each respondent, and they were exposed to respondents either to racially stereotypic or non-stereotype crime stories on local news programs. When exposed to racial stereotypes in the news, white respondents living in white homogeneous neighborhoods endorsed more punitive policies to address the crime, expressed more negative stereotype evaluations of blacks, and felt more distant from blacks as a group. The Caucasian Americans in this research experiment had a bias against the African Americans that they have encountered due to being exposed to media that portrayed African Americans as being dangerous. Tests were also performed to learn whether exposure to news about crimes committed by dark-skinned criminals increased impulsive facial threat perceptions of meeting dark-skinned strangers in a subsequent situation, but only when the facial displays are ambiguous. The assumption is that new stereotypes prime the dark-skinned criminal stereotype, which in turn influences subsequent face processing. In the research, there were 2 groups, and they were showed participants' crimes that they can read about. The crimes were committed by dark-skinned criminals, and the results of the treatment increased the perceived racial and facial threat of dark-skinned strangers. And according to the research experiment of how the news can sway someone's thoughts of a race group, the results show that the news does indeed is able to transfer a biased belief to the viewers. As predicted, the treatment increased the perceived facial threat. The results of associating news reports and dark-skinned people created a pattern between the two. Several statistics say that, according to the news and other media outlets, outside of sports games, the representation of African Americans drops precipitously, with many of the remaining featured as gangsters and street people. Another statistic says Black males are underrepresented in the roles of computer users or technical experts in television commercials, instead tending to appear in roles that put less emphasis on intellectuality. African Americans are also underrepresented as users of luxury items in commercials, instead being featured using more pedestrian consumer products. My perspective is to make laws on the type of images that are shown. That way there's uniformity, and to create outcry when things are not just and not fair in America. And that is all. Thank you for listening.